Good afternoon to everyone on the call. My name is John Thompson. I'm an auditor with Division of Energy Assistance with the LIHEAP program. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Since we have a lot of participants on the phone on this call and still joining to our webinar for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction. Having policies and procedures in place that address fraud, waste, and abuse is a great practice to prevent problems in your agency. But it also helps when these kind of issues do happen, whether at the state, agency, subgrantee, or the client level, because it provides the structure that your agency can follow to quickly address what has been identified and work towards a resolution. As a matter of fact, when we are performing site visits, it is an area where our office places a great emphasis of having procedures in place. We feel this webinar can really provide the guidance and help bolster your existing policies, especially with all the emergency funds that we have released with the pandemic. Next slide. As you can see here, with the funds that we have released starting in FY20 since the pandemic, but the regular LIHEAP funding has been over $10 billion to date. CARES Act funds, which was released in response to the coronavirus, we released over $900 million, and we really we couldn't have done it without you all working in the fields, obviously, because there was a great push. That money came out quickly, and it was a great push to have all of it obligated by the end of 2021. And working with you all, our partners, we were able to obligate and liquidate almost all 900 million of it. So we're really grateful to your efforts for helping us distribute this money. And with the American Rescue Plan Act, which currently we issued out $4.5 billion, where that money still right now is with you all, our partners in the field, and we're working with you all to find ways to obligate those funds. And we will continue to do so. The goal is to have all those funds obligated by the end of this fiscal year, FY22, and we have a 90-day liquidation period after 9/30/22 to the end of this year in order to liquidate those funds. And not too long ago, we recently released $100 million this year for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And the great thing about this is it's going to be used just for that purpose. And we have $100 million, as we said, that was distributed this year, but it's a 5-year plan. So we're going to be distributing $500 million over the next 5 years. And those funds operate in a lot of the same way as the rules and regulations for the LIHEAP block grant, where the first year you must obligate 90% of those funds, and you can carry over up to 10% of those funds into the next fiscal year. And then you can use those funds for the same purposes of heating, cooling, weatherization, Assurance 16, and also administration. So we couldn't, like I said before, we really thank you for your efforts. And I know there's a lot of money that our administration has released to help out those out who really need these funds. So we really thank you for your efforts. Right now, what I'm going to do is hopefully I want to turn this over to Chetan Mahajan of ICF, and we really hope that you find this webinar very informative and helpful today. Chetan?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Chetan Mahajan. I'm with ICF. And today the presenters from the ICF team will be Audra Thanikuri, Dee Shelkey, Blake Worthington, and Jason Clevenger. So in recent years, the following 4 categories have consistently had the greatest number of findings from federal fiscal monitoring of grantees: administrative costs, carryover and SF-425 reporting, vendor refunds, and subrecipient fiscal monitoring. OCS has created many technical assistance resources, or TA resources, which support grantees in helping to prevent and resolve issues related to these categories. However, since these categories have had the highest number of findings, which continue to reoccur, OCS tasked the ICF team with examining existing TA resources to help identify and compile TA information from all these resources into one resource for each of these categories, which we're calling a TA guide. Today's discussion focuses on our most recent TA guide for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction. Concerns related to waste, fraud, and abuse have not had the greatest number of findings from our monitoring, but we have seen instances when better awareness was needed of the requirements for waste, fraud, and abuse, including better implementation of written policies and procedures so that we could help ensure that waste, fraud, and abuse were being prevented, detected, and corrected appropriately. So this is an issue that we all know we need to prioritize for the integrity of LIHEAP. As we'd mentioned when we presented our first TA guide last year for admin costs, each TA guide isn't developed as a perfect solution. The intent is to provide you with our best effort for what we think is the information that should be considered for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds, and break it down as simply as possible into a series of, say, 5 to 10 questions to address. Hopefully, you can then provide feedback to us on how helpful the TA guides are with your own efforts for being efficient and compliant, and whether any information could be clarified or explained further. For waste, fraud, and abuse, we hope the TA guide can help you with increasing relevant awareness within your programs and ensuring that you have suitable frameworks in place to address waste, fraud, and abuse at the various operational levels for LIHEAP, whether it's at the client-facing level or with vendors, internal staff, or your partnering agencies. For this TA guide, when we speak about partnering agencies, we're referring to the entities that you work with to implement LIHEAP at the local level, such as your sub-grantees or other local offices and agencies. Please take a minute to review the list of partnering agencies on the slide. Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and start off our discussion on the TA guide for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction.
Thanks, Chetan. Hi, everyone. I'm Dee Shelkey. Thanks for joining us today. So let's start off by briefly discussing the process for developing the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Prevention, Detection, and Correction Guide. As previously mentioned, we examined grantees' LIHEAP monitoring reports and identified the most common issues for waste, fraud, and abuse. Then we studied the issues and found that they mapped to 5 common corrective actions. Next, we reviewed many of OCS's existing TA resources from their virtual library and the Navigator to identify resources that provided guidance on how to address these 5 corrective actions. From this initial review, 51 resources were identified as having the most valuable information related to these corrective actions. These resources included information memorandums, or IMs, Dear Colleague letters, or DCLs, action transmittals, or ATs, webinars, and conference and regional meeting presentations. These resources were reviewed in great detail, and then contents from some of these resources, plus additional contents created by the ICF team, were used to develop a focused 38-page TA guide. So this guide serves as one resource that grantees can review to help address and prevent common issues instead of having to search through and review multiple resources. So in today's webinar, we'll first discuss how to use the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Prevention, Detection, and Correction Guide. And then we'll take you through the guide and emphasize some key points. So please refer to the guide. It is included as a handout to this webinar. Now, the flow of this webinar will match the order of how information is presented in the guide. And while we won't cover all the material, we will refer you to page numbers so that you can find the relevant information in the guide. And this icon will indicate the starting page of where you can find that relevant information. So using the webinar in concert with the guide will give you an excellent grasp of waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction. The guide focuses on 5 core questions that grantees should address to ensure efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. So now let's discuss how to use the guide and review the guide structure. Okay, so the TA guide is structured to address the range of corrective actions that can arise from a category. And it's structured in a question and answers format, with the correction actions listed in question formed, followed by the answer, which is the guidance for how to address the corresponding corrective action. So for example, if a monitoring report required a grantee to have documented procedures for waste, fraud, and abuse, the corrective action in a question format would be how to document waste, fraud, and abuse procedures. And the layout of each guide starts with the table of contents, where you'll find the introduction, common requirements and regulations, followed by the core questions to address for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. Then the resources section that includes links to the OCS resources that were primarily used to develop the guide. And lastly, the appendices. And we won't go over the appendices today, but there is a lot of useful information and examples in them. For instance, Appendix E provides information on defining obligations and expenditures. So please review them later. And as we go through the core questions, we'll point you to the specific appendices.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Hi, everyone. I'm Audra Thanikary. Welcome to today's webinar. Now, in addition to the TA guide, a self-assessment checklist will also be included as a handout to this webinar. Note that the left column in the self-assessment follows the guide's table of contents. As you read the TA guide, reflect on the 5 core questions and document any thoughts. The checklist could help you keep track of these items. What you are doing well. In those cases, there isn't much need for improvement. Areas that you want to know more about, or areas where there may be an opportunity for improvement. Areas where you can share your success and help other grantees, for example, by sharing your written procedures, tools, and templates. And lastly, you can document any next steps. We know a lot of grantees are doing a great job in many of these areas, but to continuously improve your programs, consider periodically revisiting this checklist to identify and resolve any opportunities for improvement. Please reach out to OCS if you identify any areas where you would like additional TA and for areas for which you would like to share your success. These are the 5 core questions from the guide that we will be discussing regarding waste, fraud, and abuse. How to document waste, fraud, and abuse procedures, how to communicate these procedures, how to establish internal control activities to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse, how to monitor these internal control activities, and how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of waste, fraud, and abuse. Now over to Jason to conduct our first poll question.
Thanks, Audra. Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Clevenger. And for today's first poll, let's stay with the 5 core questions so that you can all take a moment to pause and reflect on your program. We'll get into each in more detail soon, but at first glance, which of these would you say are the 2 questions that your program addresses well? You may be doing all of them very well, or a few of them better than others, but for now, just pick the first 2 that come to mind, and please type that number into the chat pod. Again, here on the slide are the 5 questions that we just went through. Okay, so I see a 1 and 2. 3s, another 1 and 2. And again, this is no right or wrong answers. It's just the first that come to mind. A couple more 3s. Another 1 and 2. So folks feeling that they're documenting and communicating the procedures well, that's good to know. Also good to know that folks are establishing internal control activity as well. give everybody a few more seconds. Some more twos, a 4. Again, just want to see what you all think you're doing well in your program. No right or wrong answers. Okay. Great. Love the participation. Yes.
So Jason?
Yes, John.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to step in real quick. I've seen a lot of questions in the chat about uploading the TA guide and the self-assessment checklist. Just to let everyone know, I'm going to do that right now. I should have mentioned that in the beginning of the webinar, so I'm going to upload those 2 attachments in the chat right now. Okay. Sorry about that, Jason.
That sounds great. Thank you for doing that, John. And thanks everybody for participating in the first poll. So before we go into detail on these questions, let's start off by briefly discussing the definitions of waste, fraud, and abuse, as well as relevant regulations and requirements. We'll also briefly discuss mismanagement. We will point out some red flags that could be indicators of waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement. A red flag should require investigation and adequate examination of the situation before you can be able to determine whether or not waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement has occurred or could occur. The definition of waste is the act of using or expending money or resources carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. Waste does not necessarily involve fraud or illegal acts. However, it may be an indication of potential fraud or illegal acts and may still impact the achievement of defined objectives. Some red flags for waste include making unnecessary purchases, making travel choices that are contrary to existing travel policies or are unnecessarily extravagant or expensive, making procurement or vendor selections that are contrary to existing policies or are unnecessarily extravagant or expensive, bottlenecks due to manual redundant methods, extravagant, careless, or needless expenditure of government funds, or unusual spending near the end of the grant period, often done to avoid losing expiring funds. Fraud, on the other hand, is defined as attempting to obtain something of value through willful misrepresentation. Only the judicial system or other adjudicative system can determine whether an act is indeed fraud. Fraud red flags include more than one explanation for an expense, round dollar claims or other amounts that look questionable, the inability or refusal to provide supporting documentation in a reasonable amount of time, plagiarize or otherwise false or misleading reports, or unresponsive recipients.
Hello, everyone. I'm Blake Worthington, and as many of you may know, I was supporting LIHEAP as the state coordinator in Tennessee. Well, now I'm looking forward to supporting all of you with the ICF team. Thanks again for joining us today. So grant fraud is the intentional misuse of grant funds in a manner that is not consistent with goals and objectives identified in the grant. Grant fraud encompasses a wide range of improper activities that can be summarized in 3 general categories. First, conflict of interest, such as hiring a relative as an employee. Second, theft, for example, fictitious transactions. And third, material false statements. An example would be falsifying certifications. Please refer to the guide for many more examples of each of these categories. To fight fraud, grantees must not only realize that it occurs, but also how and why it occurs. There are 3 elements of fraud risk factors of the fraud triangle. The fraud triangle was developed by Donald Cressy, who is a well-known criminologist. The risk factors are opportunity, pressure, also known as incentive or motivation, and rationalization, sometimes just called justification or attitude. While the risk of fraud may be greatest when all 3 risk factors are present, One or more of these factors may indicate a fraud risk. This diagram on the screen provides examples for each fraud risk factor. Please take a moment and read the examples. Other information provided by internal and external parties can also be used to identify fraud risk. This may include allegations of fraud or suspected fraud reported by the Office of the Inspector General, internal auditors, personnel, or external parties that interact with the grantee. Now, abuse is the behavior that is deficient or improper when compared with the behavior that a prudent person would consider reasonable and necessary operational practice given the facts and circumstances. This includes the misuse of authority or position for personal gain or for the benefit of someone else. Now, abuse does not necessarily involve fraud or illegal acts and excludes fraud and noncompliance with provisions of laws, regulations, contracts, and grant agreements. However, it may be an indication of potential fraud or illegal acts and may still impact the achievement of defined objectives. Abuse red flags include writing technical specifications or contract terms to favor a specific contractor, creating unneeded overtime, requesting staff to perform personal errands or work tasks for a supervisor or manager, and misusing the official's position for personal gain. Now let's look at mismanagement. Mismanagement is the act of creating a substantial risk to a grantee's partnering agency's ability to accomplish its mission. For effective grants management, an assessment of mismanagement should not just focus on the financial risk, but also the risk to meeting a grant award contractual requirements, performance standards, and other desired outcomes tied to the use of funds. Mismanagement could be the result of poor processes or poor management. For example, lack of training or processes not being followed or aligned with one another. An inadequate process could result in follow-up actions to correct it and could result in additional costs being incurred to implement and resolve corrective actions. Now, some examples of mismanagement are continuing to pay utility bills for formerly leased office space, renewing a technical support contract or software that's no longer being used, and stockpiling equipment beyond its shelf life. Mismanagement red flags include the lack of clear or written policies, faulty accounting, limited staff oversight and training, little documentation or missing records, purchasing items that are not on the approved budget, or the same mistakes that are reoccurring. Note that not all mismanagement results in fraud, waste, and abuse, especially if mismanagement is identified and adequately resolved prior to the instant of fraud, waste, or abuse. Now, effective management is needed to be able to prevent, detect, and correct fraud, waste, and abuse, including implementing processes such as internal control activities that allow structure and control over key activities. We will continue this discussion about internal controls later in the webinar. Now that we've gotten an idea about what waste, fraud, and abuse is, let's take a step back and look at some relevant requirements and regulations. Please note that LIHEAP grantees continue to be the primary interpreters of the LIHEAP statute. HHS will accept the grantee's interpretation of the statute as long as they're in agreement with laws and not considered clearly erroneous. What we've listed are common requirements and regulations on this slide. While we won't go into detail in many of these today, please take a few moments to look over the list and refer to the TA guide for more information. When you want to better understand LIHEAP grant requirements and regulations, it would be good to start with the review of ACF and LIHEAP terms and conditions. Those are the terms and conditions that you agree to in order to receive the LIHEAP grant award. Now let's go ahead and start on the discussion of our core questions.
Thanks, Blake. Our first core question is how to document waste, fraud, and abuse procedures. This is an important question because we've seen from our monitoring that some grantees did not have written implemented waste, fraud, and abuse procedures. When documenting these procedures, you should take into consideration that for them to be readily implementable, they should be consistent with your relevant organizational, state, tribal, or territorial procedures and processes. So let's now get into the details of documenting waste, fraud, and abuse procedures. Procedures explain how to carry out a process. For example, there may be a process for updating waste, fraud, and abuse requirements in vendor agreements, and another process for investigating instances of waste, fraud, and abuse. For these processes, procedures help clarify the applicable and necessary who, what, when, where, and how details of performing the process. Procedures should ensure all who work on LIHEAP have a comprehensive understanding of LIHEAP's processes and their roles and responsibilities. Today, we will go over a few examples of information that could be included in your waste, fraud, and abuse procedures. But for a more comprehensive list, please refer to the guide. So, for example, these procedures could specify who is responsible for the overall process and for completing various elements within the process. What information and supporting documents are needed to complete the process, when to review and update the procedures, where training and educational resources regarding the process are located, and lastly, how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of waste, fraud, and abuse. Later in the webinar, we'll discuss how to track these activities. But before we move to the next core question, I wanted to mention that the guide also includes some helpful tips for writing procedures.
Thanks, Audra. Now let's discuss common communication methods to consider for distributing and providing guidance and training on your policies. Please note in the LIHEAP model plan, grantees are required to communicate mechanisms available to the public for reporting cases of suspected waste, fraud, and abuse, procedures for investigating and prosecuting reports of fraud, and any sanctions placed on clients, staff, or vendors found to have committed fraud. But over the next couple of slides, we will be going over additional common methods that you can consider for communicating these procedures to your internal staff, partnering agencies, vendors, and clients. Not only is it important for grantees to communicate waste, fraud, and abuse procedures to grantee staff, communication should be fostered between program and fiscal staff, especially staff that oversee LIHEAP day-to-day activities. LIHEAP program staff should consider LIHEAP fiscal staff as key communication partners, as LIHEAP has a significant fiscal component. Here are some common methods we've seen during our monitoring visits for communicating to internal staff. You could use the grantee's internal procedures manual, the grantee's LIHEAP operations manual. Please see Appendix A of the guide for examples of waste, fraud, and abuse policies from several different grantees' LIHEAP operations manuals. Meetings. Meetings could be held to discuss potential or known waste, fraud, and abuse instances and corrective actions. Training and technical assistance sessions, and the grantee's internal hotline or website. Also, just a reminder about the HHS Office of Inspector General, or OIG. You should make not only your internal staff, but also your partnering agencies, vendors, and clients aware of the ability to share concerns related to waste, fraud, or abuse of government funds, and refer suspected cases to the OIG hotline. Please see the guide for more information.
Now, as Jason mentioned, grantees should communicate waste, fraud, and abuse procedures to all partnering agencies in order to help ensure compliance with these policies. And here are some common ways that we've seen grantees communicate their procedures to partnering agencies. The grantee's LIHEAP operational manual, which is one of the most important documents that a grantee can utilize to communicate waste, fraud, and abuse procedures to partnering agencies. Partnering agency contracts or other agreements, tribe state agreements or similar efforts to coordinate to help prevent detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. And you can see the guide for additional examples of tri-state coordination. Training and technical assistance sessions and conferences. Conferences can serve as an opportunity for you to talk with a partnering agency about waste, fraud, and abuse procedures and any specific trends related to concerns that you're seeing. Similar to partnering agencies, grantees should communicate waste, fraud, and abuse procedures to all vendors to help ensure compliance with these procedures. Here are some common ways that grantees can communicate to vendors. Vendor agreements. Vendor agreements are an essential tool to help ensure and enhance program integrity. For example, a vendor agreement can specify waste, fraud, and abuse procedures, including fiscal controls and oversight to prevent customer fraud and possible theft or misdirection of LIHEAP funds by the vendor's employees. And also conferences. Conferences are a great opportunity to talk to vendors about waste, fraud, and abuse procedures and to better understand their success or challenges with implementing these procedures. And lastly, grantees should communicate waste, fraud, and abuse requirements to all of their clients. Here are a few ways to do that. The LIHEAP application, the client application. This is one of the most important documents that a grantee can utilize to communicate these requirements. And you can see Appendix B of the guide for examples of waste, fraud, and abuse information from several grantees' LIHEAP client applications. Also, the grantee's website. Grantees could provide guidance on their website for how to identify and report concerns related to waste, fraud, and abuse, and also could have an anonymous submission system for clients to report suspected instances. Grantees could provide a link or information about this on their website in their client application. And then via outreach and client awareness materials. Grantee outreach and client awareness material could include where and how to report suspected fraud, waste, and abuse. Examples of relevant material, including posters in every LIHEAP office or intake site, energy assistance fact sheets, newsletters, announcements or agendas for public hearings and other public meetings. So this wraps up communication, but please refer to the guide for additional information and examples of communication methods to staff, partnering agencies, vendors, and clients.
Thanks, Blake. So now let's take another moment for you to pause and reflect on your program. There are many different ways to communicate waste, fraud, and abuse requirements to your clients. Which of the following ways are you communicating these requirements to your clients? Through the client LIHEAP application, through your website, outreach and client awareness material, all of the above, or E other? Please take a few moments and type your answer into the chat pod. Okay, lots of D's. Seems like a lot of grantees are doing everything on the board. That's good to know. If you're doing something else, if you've got an E, feel free to put that in there as well. Public hearing on the application and through outreach. Again, a lot of D's. Showing people are doing all of these. Great, that's super helpful to know. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Jason. So now let's talk about how to establish internal control activities to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. HHS LIHEAP Block Grant Regulation 45 CFR 96.84C states that grantees must establish appropriate systems and procedures to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse in activities funded under the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. The systems and procedures are to address possible waste, fraud, and abuse by clients, vendors, and administrating agencies. So, to comply with this requirement, grantees should establish targeted waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities at all levels of their program's administration. So let's start by defining internal control activities. They are the actions management establishes through policies and procedures to help achieve objectives and respond to risks. So when developing these activities for waste, fraud, and abuse, program and fiscal staff should consider the objectives that they're trying to achieve and the risks that they are trying to mitigate so that the most effective internal control activities are developed. And internal control activities can be implemented as either automated activities through information technology, or they can be performed manually by individuals with minor use of information technology. Now, automated activities tend to be more reliable because they are less susceptible to human error and are typically more efficient. And we'll go over some examples of both kinds of internal control activities in just a minute. Okay, now there are three types of internal control activities. And there are preventive activities, which prevent an organization from failing to achieve an objective or address a risk. Preventive controls can be the most effective and efficient means to minimize waste, fraud, and abuse because you are proactively addressing and trying to resolve the risk beforehand. Then detective activities, which detect when an organization is not achieving an objective or addressing a risk so that the necessary corrections can be made. And corrective activities, which correct identified instances when an organization does not achieve an objective or address a risk. So let's go over a few examples of waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities. Now, our examples will be of the benefit payment process. And you are already probably doing something similar to our examples, but it may help to see the activities categorized by control type. So in our first example, which shows an automated and preventive internal control activity type, the objective of the activity is to prevent ineligible clients from receiving benefit payments. The grantee's intake system has a software program that automatically cross-checks applicants' identities, that's their social security numbers, through data exchange with utilities. Then the intake system will transfer any unmatched applicant's social security numbers to a pending stage, preventing further processing of the applications until social security numbers can be determined. And in this example, the grantee matches social security numbers to utility information because the utilities require a social security number to open an account. Okay, so for our next example, it shows a manual and detective control activity. In this example, the objective is to detect benefit payment errors, specifically overpayments to clients. So on a monthly basis, a grantee manually reconciles each client's approved benefit amount to the benefit amount applied to the client's utility account to detect overpayments. And now the third example is manual and corrective, and the objective is to correct any overpayment errors detected from the previous activity. So if an overpayment is detected, the grantee manually initiates a process to correct the overpayment by submitting a refund request form to the utility vendor. And that wraps up the examples, but please note that different or additional control activities for the benefit payment process would need to be performed depending on each of your program requirements and resources. And you can also see the guide for a few more examples.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Now let's discuss program integrity. Grantees are encouraged to support the critical program integrity effort of establishing targeted internal control activities to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. Key areas of focus for sound program integrity include eligibility, fiscal management, and oversight and monitoring. We will discuss each of these key areas over the next couple of slides. So on the previous slide, I mentioned that grantees are encouraged to support program integrity efforts by establishing internal control activities to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. There are many different internal control activities you can establish. However, today, as we discuss internal control activities related to the key areas for sound program integrity, we will focus on internal control activities to obtain, verify, and maintain suitable information. When you are establishing or enhancing your internal control activities, please keep in mind that first, you could obtain suitable information. For example, to support the income declared by a client on their LIHEAP application, you might ask for their pay stub. Then verify that information to confirm that the income amount is correct. For example, you could verify the income by cross-checking it with the Social Security Administration or other reliable electronic databases. And lastly, maintain the suitable information that you gathered. For example, a copy of the pay stub and confirmation that data was verified with a specific database could be maintained in the client's case file as supporting documentation.
Thanks, Audra. So now let's discuss the first key area for sound program integrity, which is eligibility. Grantees should establish waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities to ensure LIHEAP benefits are provided only to eligible households. So first, grantees should obtain suitable information to support a client's identity and income. We're going to look at just a few examples on the slide. You will need to determine what information is suitable based on your program's requirements. So for example, to support a client's identity, you could obtain Social Security number for the applicant and the household members. And to support the client's income, you could obtain pay stubs and or Social Security award letters. Now, please note that the federal LIHEAP office cannot require to obtain Social Security numbers. However, to enhance program integrity, grantees are strongly encouraged to require that LIHEAP applicants provide Social Security numbers in order to receive a LIHEAP benefit. If Social Security numbers are obtained, grantees should establish adequate internal control activities to safeguard Social Security numbers and other sensitive application information. You can see Appendix C in the guide for the security and privacy tips. Next, grantees should verify. They should verify suitable information to confirm a client's identity and income. For example, you could consider using electronic data verification to confirm an applicant's identity or income. This could be done using the following sources: databases for public assistance programs, such as the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program and the Supplemental Food and Nutrition program, also known as TANF and SNAP, the Social Security Administration, Medicaid, and state unemployment and child support offices. And finally, grantees should maintain suitable information to support a client's identity and income, and other relevant information that was used to determine the client's eligibility. This information is usually maintained in the client case files and could include the application and other required forms and documents, the calculations used to compute income, and documentation to support the performance of all of the verification procedures.
Up next is the second key area of focus for sound program integrity, fiscal management. Grantees should establish waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities to ensure LIHEAP funds are properly spent and accounted for. Today, our focus will be on fiscal management for vendor benefit payments. So sticking with our obtain, verify, and maintain processes, first, you should obtain suitable information to ensure vendor benefit payments are for allowable purposes and properly accounted for. Examples of information include partnering agency contracts that establish rights and responsibilities, vendor agreements that outline requirements, and documentation from vendors to show benefits were applied accurately to client accounts and show any remaining credit balances on client accounts. Next, you should verify suitable information to confirm vendor benefit payments are for allowable purposes and properly accounted for. The guide has a range of examples that you could look at, but for now, let's discuss 2 additional examples of verification activities and/or methods. Review weatherization final inspection reports to confirm work has been completed prior to issuing final vendor payments. On a monitoring site visit, we observed a grantee making final payments to contractors before conducting final inspections. This practice could potentially lead to waste of LIHEAP funds if the contractor received payment for work for on a home when the work order had not been adequately completed. The second example is to review the date of vendor benefit payments on the general ledgers and compare them to the dates of payments on bank statements. This can help check that there isn't a significant lag in time from when the expenditures are recorded on the general ledgers and when the funds are received by the vendors. This practice could potentially detect mismanagement where vendors aren't getting paid in a timely manner. Okay, and lastly, grantees should maintain suitable information to support that vendor benefit payments are for allowable purposes and properly accounted for. For example, grantees should maintain a list of approved vendors that is periodically updated, as well as their current IRS Form W-9s and/or business licenses, executed vendor agreements for all vendors, and you should maintain suitable document and client files that support the benefit provided to clients. For example, you could include a copy of the client's notification letter with the award amount. Although this slide focuses on maintaining suitable information to support vendor benefit payments, to have sound program integrity, grantees should maintain documentation that supports all LIHEAP funds are being used for allowable purposes and are properly accounted for. During our monitoring, we have observed some grantees and sub-grantees not maintaining documentation to support transactions recorded on their LIHEAP general ledgers. Without being able to review supporting documentation, it could not be confirmed that LIHEAP funds were being used for allowable purposes and properly accounted for. In turn, not being able to ensure that funds were used properly and for allowable purposes increased the risk for waste, fraud, and abuse to occur. So let's move on to the third area of focus, oversight and monitoring. We will start with a quick reminder of LIHEAP Statute Section 2605B10, commonly referred to as Assurance 10, which states that grantees must establish fiscal control and accounting procedures to assure proper dispersal of and accounting of federal funds, including procedures for monitoring LIHEAP and complying with single audit requirements. So with Assurance 10 in mind for fiscal control and accounting procedures, grantees should establish oversight and monitoring activities to help ensure compliance with federal and state, tribal, territorial, and other relevant internal guidance for waste, fraud, and abuse policies and/or procedures. And similar to the other internal control activities we discussed, oversight and monitoring internal control activities should also include obtaining, verifying, and maintaining suitable supporting information to achieve objectives and/or mitigate risk. And when establishing and implementing oversight and monitoring activities, you could consider using data mining techniques. Data mining can improve organizational decision-making, including helping detect data anomalies and trends. For example, data mining can help identify duplicate entries for Social Security numbers, household numbers, and address fields on LIHEAP applications. It can also allow for insightful data analysis. For example, it can allow you to examine clusters of data to maybe see whether an issue might be regional instead of widespread, to then allow for targeted regional oversight and monitoring of the issue. Please see Appendix F in the guide for more information on data mining techniques.
So here are several examples to consider when establishing internal control activities for oversight and monitoring. You should maintain an effective system of waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities. But please don't forget that these activities should be documented in policies and procedures, communicated to relevant staff, and monitored to ensure that they are operating effectively. The waste, fraud, and abuse policies and procedures should be documented and updated as often as needed and to ensure that they're current. You should provide training on these procedures. Training could include guidance on how to identify waste, fraud, and abuse risk, and how to prevent those waste, fraud, and abuse. Then you should incorporate management or peer reviews and quality control checks. For examples, you could consider creating a step-by-step guide or checkoff list for peer reviews and quality control checks. Now, please take a minute to read through these other objectives that are on the screen. So lastly, to ensure your oversight and monitoring addresses internal control activities for investigating and prosecuting fraud, waste, and abuse, please see Appendix G in the guide for examples of grantee practices of fraud, investigation, and prosecution. For a few examples of grantee practices for client rights when it comes to investigation and prosecution. Okay, let's take a break for another poll. We've discussed the 3 key areas of focus for program integrity, eligibility, fiscal management, and oversight and monitoring. Now, in your program, which of these 3 areas do you focus on specifically in your day-to-day work? Now, there isn't one right answer, as you may be doing one or all of them, but we can get a better idea of people's roles. So answer A, if it's eligibility, B, if you're responsible for fiscal management, and C, if it's oversight and monitoring. You can type the corresponding letter in your response in the chat pod. So seeing all over the board, we've got a lot of A's and C's. A lot of C's. Some more, there's a B. Yes, A and C is, so a lot of eligibility and a lot of oversight and monitoring. So from the program side, we've got a D, so I'm guessing that's all of it. Probably wearing multiple hats and involved in multiple aspects of program integrity. So I know that a lot of people have crossover with different parts of LIHEAP. So a lot of A's and C's though, a lot of program focus. So eligibility and oversight and monitoring. So thank you for all of these responses, and it helps for us to get an idea and have some additional insight on the different roles and responsibilities that everyone plays in the LIHEAP program.
Okay, great. Thanks, Blake. Now on to question 4, how to monitor waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities. So LIHEAP's governed by the OMB Uniform Administrative Guidance as adopted by HHS and its regulations at 45 CFR Part 75, under which requirement 75.342A is for grantees to monitor activities under federal awards to assure compliance with applicable federal requirements and performance expectations are being achieved. To comply with this requirement, grantees should monitor their internal control activities to ensure that they are operating effectively to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. The process for monitoring these activities could include these 3 steps. assessing the effectiveness of the internal control activities, correcting any issues, and documenting the process for monitoring these internal control activities. It's important to note that in addition to monitoring your own waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities, you should also monitor the internal control activities of your subgrantees. And for example, during a monitoring visit, we observed that a subgrantee was using LIHEAP funds for unallowable LIHEAP purposes. We learned that the grantee had not been able to detect and correct these issues as the grantee had stopped conducting comprehensive fiscal monitoring as a result of staffing shortages. So if the grantee had been monitoring its subgrantees' internal control activities appropriately, it may have been able to detect and correct the unallowable use of LIHEAP funds and address the risk for waste to occur or continue occurring. So let's discuss step 1, assessing the effectiveness. As you need to have a process in place for assessing the effectiveness of your waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities, as well as those of your partnering agencies. So to develop this process, you could first determine which waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities will be assessed. And you could prioritize assessing the following types of activities: high-risk activities, activities that have had a prior history of not being effective, preventive activities, and new activities, which are usually established due to operational changes and other risk factors. Now, an important area for assessing internal control activities could be for your intake process and your case file management. And Appendix D in the guide has more information on this. So after you've determined which activities to assess, you then need to decide on what methods to use to assess these activities. And the methods could include inspection, such as inspecting case files to ensure that relevant supervisory or other quality control reviews were conducted and documented correctly. Observation, for example, observing where case files are maintained to ensure that they're being kept in a secure location when not in use. And inquiry, for instance, inquiring with IT staff to verify that automated controls are working effectively to prevent unauthorized access to case files. Then decide when would these activities be assessed. For example, should it be done once a year or more often? And lastly, decide who will assess these activities. And ideally, the person assessing these activities should be credible and unbiased and should have the knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform the assessment. Okay, now on to step 2, correcting waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activity issues. So if you identify any issue with an activity, say for example, the activity is no longer effective, you should take timely corrective action to resolve the issue. Corrective action could start with you discussing the issue with the staff members who perform the activity. So you can determine what challenges are they experiencing? When do they start experiencing these challenges? Are they currently performing any other activities to resolve the issues? And is there anything else that could be done to resolve the issue? Then, after analyzing the issue and having these discussions, an appropriate corrective action should be implemented, which could include creating new or modifying existing activities or policies and procedures.
And now the final step, documenting the process for monitoring waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activities. There are 2 parts to this process. Part 1 is documenting the activity details, which could include a description of the control activity, who is performing the assessment, when is the assessment being conducted, methods used to assess the control activity, for example, inspection, observation, or inquiry, and a list of items included in the assessment sample selection. For more information on how to determine sample selections and sample sizes, please refer to Appendix H in the guide. Now on to part 2, which is documenting the assessment steps. These steps could include a description of the activity assessment steps. For example, steps for inspecting a sample of disbursements might include verifying that the date, amount, and payee per the purchase order, invoice, and proof of payment are all in agreement. Next, you could document the results and observations from performing assessment steps, including whether the activity was performed and whether it was operating effectively to prevent, detect, and/or correct waste, fraud, and abuse. Then you could document the corrective actions and any additional waste, fraud, and abuse internal control activity concerns identified during the assessment.
We will now discuss the final core question, question number 5, how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of waste, fraud, and abuse. Let's revisit HHS LIHEAP Block Grant Regulation 45 CFR 96.84C discussed earlier. Note the part of the requirement for grantees to correct waste, fraud, and abuse in activities funded under the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. To help comply with this requirement, grantees could develop a tracking system. An effective tracking system could consist of a schedule of dates for key activities to allow for timely follow-up and notes regarding the instance, corrective action, and key activities to allow a reviewer to get an understanding of each instance and the progress of the corrective action. During our monitoring, we observed a subgrantee with an active investigation that they were pursuing for fraud. In this case, a LIHEAP client used someone else's identity in order to claim a larger household size. The grantee was unaware of the status of this investigation. If the grantee had an effective tracking system, they would have been able to provide the status. To support the effectiveness of the tracking system, training can be provided to staff on how to use the system, including how and where the system will be stored, for example, in a shared documentation repository, and how and where notes need to be entered into the system. A staff person could be assigned the responsibility of ensuring that the tracking system is kept up to date and operating as needed, including notifying relevant staff or partnering agencies when items are due from them. And depending on how notes are categorized in the tracking system, data from the system could also be used to support program effectiveness by identifying any needs for TA to help resolve the instance and prevent similar future instances. For more information on waste, fraud, and abuse tracking, please refer to the guide.
All right, now that we've discussed all 5 of the core questions in more detail, this poll, let's regroup and take some time to reflect on each. At the start of our webinar, we asked you to think about which of these your program was doing well. Now we want to ask you to think about one question that you'd like to study further, either in the TA guide or from your own review of resources. Again, you may already be addressing this question, but we would still like to see and examine what you would want to learn more about it. So go ahead and type the corresponding number of your response in the chat pod. Again, there's no right answer. Just provide which one you would like to study further. Seeing a lot of 4s, so monitoring. Some 3s, 5s, tracking. Got some 1s, so documenting. Really all over the board, but it looks like monitoring is a big one. So monitoring fraud, waste, and abuse internal control activities, establishing some, so that's good. And hopefully there's great resources that you can get from the TA guide and the appendices with some good examples to review as well. So, all right, thank you guys so much. Again, thanks for the responses. And for the question that you selected to examine further, you can go ahead and review that on your own. And we found that often we have so much that we're curious about and that we want to learn more about, but taking it one question at a time should hopefully help with prioritizing your learning and doing it at a pace that works well for you. So thanks again.
Thanks, Blake. Let's all do a quick wrap up now. As you can see, our vision for the TA guide is to provide you with targeted guidance in a format that's easy to read and easy to implement. And as you all read the guide and share it with your teams for further review and discussion, think about your LIHEAP program's strengths and weaknesses. Identify any areas where improvements could be made, and then make those enhancements to your program. The self-assessment checklist should help you with documenting this information in one place. And please provide feedback to OCS if additional clarification would be helpful, or if you have ideas for additional items to include in the next version of the TA guide for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction. It would especially be helpful for us if you could provide feedback on where you think you've got strong procedures, tools, and templates that you could share with us so that we can learn from them and share them with other grantees. Here are some of the resources that we found were very helpful to develop content for the guide. After you've reviewed the guide, you could review these resources as well if you'd like to study them further. These resources are also in the resources section of the guide. So the resources we discussed were all found on the virtual library, OCS website, and the navigator. They're all great places to look for a variety of TA content, and you can do keyword searches to help look for anything specific. Also, just announced in January of this year is the US Government Accountability Office Anti-Fraud Resource, which was developed as an online interactive resource to inform federal officials, Congress, the media, and the public about fraud schemes and how to combat them. Please take a look at that as well. And I just want to let you know that OCS is planning on sending you a survey soon to evaluate the training that we provided today. Please complete the survey so that we can get your feedback and keep trying to support you and your teams as best as we can with technical assistance for LIHEAP. Thank you all for your time, and John, back to you.
Thank you, Chetan, and thank you, ICF, for a very informative webinar. A lot of information that was spoken about today, and I really hope that I saw from the comments and the answers in the polls that it seems like a lot of grantees on the phone right now already have some kind of fraud, waste, and abuse policies in place or things of that nature. So, you know, I really, if that's the case, then, you know, this assessment will be definitely something, this webinar and using the self-assessment in the TA guide would be something that you could use to really enhance your program. There's some very key areas that were spoken about, like internal controls, you know, the preventive and detective and corrective measures that can be taken. We talked about program integrity from an eligibility and fiscal management oversight and monitoring standpoint. And also the assessing the effectiveness of your waste, fraud, and abuse program that you have in place, which ties into your internal controls. So a lot of rich things that you can see that you can work on, I should say. And if you see there is a need, then please, by all means, I know all of us have busy schedules with our jobs and a lot of things that we're managing, and sometimes even not enough staff. But definitely, as we mentioned in the beginning, fraud, waste, and abuse is a very important area of your program that you would definitely pay heed to be ahead of it than behind it. So if there's some work needed to be done to improve the process of your program in that area, I encourage you to do so. Thank you for everyone. You know, OCS definitely wants to thank everyone. Just, you know, to this you who gets the work done, and just with LIHEAP and ensuring that LIHEAP has the impact that it's intended to have, and which is to provide energy assistance to as many low-income households as possible, and helping them all the recipients strive towards the goal of self-sufficiency. So we really want to thank you all for all that you do, and continue. The pandemic definitely brought out a lot of ways of how we can improve our processes and be more efficient at getting out administering LIHEAP. But also, LIHEAP can still reach more areas around the country. And so we just want to continue to encourage everyone to look for more processes of how LIHEAP can reach deeper in the communities of where you're serving. As you see, I'm John Thompson. Here's my point of contact information should you need to contact me about anything. As you see, Iris Curtis, my other auditor, is no longer with the LIHEAP program. She's moved on to better, bigger things, I should say. LIHEAP is a great program. We do miss her sorely, but also you all have your federal LIHEAP contacts your federal liaisons of each of your regions that I'm sure everyone has their contact information. So now we're on to the question and answer part of our presentation. And so I saw there were many, I'm going to continue to look in the chat, but I would encourage everyone, if they have any questions that they want to be addressed, to please open up the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type it in there. Going through there right now, I see that the majority of the questions were surrounded around the slides, and can you download a copy of those? I did upload those to the chat box, so I hope everyone was able to get a copy of the TA guide, Training and Technical Assistance Guide, and the self-assessment. And a copy of this presentation will be posted on our website in a few weeks once it goes through the clearance process. So if I'll continue to look for any additional questions, but we will also have some questions that we have thought up here as well that hopefully can assist you, maybe get your mind moving in the direction of things you may want to answer or ask us while on the webinar right now. So one question is, we've heard a lot about internal controls in this discussion, but aren't internal controls more of an audit function that auditors or financial staff typically work on? So shouldn't auditors or financial staff be responsible for internal controls for fraud, waste, and abuse? I'm going to ask Chetan Mahajan if he could provide the answer for that.
Sure, John. So it's true that we often hear about internal controls being mentioned in audit reports or in financial discussions. And that's typically because an important part of audit and financial work is understanding internal controls and making sure they're working as needed. But as we mentioned in our discussion, internal controls are a management tool that are needed for effective management in all aspects of your LIHEAP programs, whether it's fiscal or program items. So again, internal controls are simply activities that management puts into place through policies and procedures to help achieve objectives and respond to risks. And we all implement internal control activities in our day-to-day work. We just aren't used to labeling them as internal controls. One way to help figure out if you're working on an internal control is to think, what am I preventing, detecting, or correcting with a certain activity? And what is the management objective for why I'm doing this? For example, I need to enter a unique username and password to sign on to HHS's OLDC system to review federal financial reports and carryover reports. So that's a preventive control HHS management has in place with the objective of ensuring that only authorized users can access OLDC and to prevent unauthorized users from accessing OLDC. So we hope this feedback and the information in the TA guide helps make internal controls a more approachable topic, especially when it comes to addressing waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement.
Thanks, Chatton. And that is very true what you said. That a lot of our day-to-day work does fall into the category of internal controls. We just aren't used to labeling them that way or seeing them as internal controls. It was an excellent response. I have another question. Some of the examples listed as red flags seem to be actual incidents of waste, fraud, and abuse or mismanagement. For example, it was mentioned that an unnecessary purchase is a red flag for waste, fraud, and abuse. Isn't that an actual instance of waste and not a red flag? Chatton?
Yeah. So you're right that an unnecessary purchase could be waste. For that matter, it could be abuse or fraud or mismanagement. Or when looked into further, it could be that there wasn't really an issue there as the additional item purchased was needed, but you didn't have all the information yet to make that determination. So we talk about red flags so that we're all looking out for them and then require investigation and adequate examination of a situation before we can make a determination about whether or not waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement has occurred or could occur. Or we might determine that everything's okay, as after following up on the red flag, we found out that there are no concerns as we just needed more information about the situation.
Thanks, Chatton. I have two more questions I'd like to read out if that you can answer these as well. The first one is, or the third one is, do waste, fraud, and abuse or mismanagement always result in improper payments?
Not always. So waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement can lead to non-compliant and inefficient use of federal funds. One outcome of which can be an improper payment. So, a payment that should not have been made, or a payment that was made in the incorrect amount. With improper payments, as it is with our other concerns or challenges any of us might have for waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement, our approach is to ideally be able to prevent them, especially with suitable internal controls in place. And then if they have occurred, we need to urgently try to identify root causes and resolve them as soon as possible.
That was a great response, Chatton. And I just have one last question for you, Chatton, that could be helpful for anyone on the phone. It can be confusing to differentiate between or have a clear distinction between fraud, waste, and abuse and mismanagement, as they're often spoken about together, or often the focus is on fraud and not on the rest of the categories like waste and abuse. So what's the best way to know which is which?
So I agree it can be difficult. At times we find that confusing to figure out as well, especially as there can be some gray area between them and even some overlap. So for example, mismanagement could lead to waste. So I'll tell you what we did when developing the TA guide. To make sure we weren't confusing waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, we looked for and then included definitions for each of them in the guide. And then we kept referring to the definitions to make sure we were clear about whether we were talking about waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement in other parts of the guide. We have those definitions in the introduction section, so please take a look at them. And then also, keep in mind that your agencies might have their own written definitions for each of these terms. So please be aware of your own agency's definitions.
That's a great response, Chatton. I thank you for answering those as well. And as you were speaking, we had one clarification point that was brought up. And so it was regarding my earlier comments in the beginning in regards to the ARP funds and the liquidation period. So I just wanted to clarify that when I spoke about the liquidation period, it was in regards to drawing down funds from PMS. But when we were we had this issue as well with the CARES Act funds as well, and ultimately, the liquidation period was extended beyond that in PMS. But what I wanted to clarify is that the liquidation period is based upon your rules, your expenditure rules, and at your state level. So, I wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between the two of what I was referring to as far as the liquidation period, as far as regarding to PMS, in the drawdown period at PMS, which I was referring to, and I did not want to confuse that with the expenditure or liquidation rules that exist at your state level, which could be different. And that goes for all of our grantees, whether it's your state rules, tribal rules, or territory rules, whatever exists at your agency. So I just wanted to make sure and clarify that. And I want to thank Kate Thomas for bringing that up. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so I see one more comment that the guide is not visible, and I can definitely understand that since there are a lot of people were responding on the chat. So I will post one more time. I will post the TA guide in the self-assessment checklist at the conclusion of this webinar. So right now we have a few minutes left, but it looks like we don't have any more questions, so we'll give it a few more minutes. But in the meantime, as we're waiting, I'll post those things. I'll post those two items to the chat right now for anyone who did not get them earlier. Okay, so hopefully you should see now in the chat box the self-assessment checklist and the training the TA guide that we were referring to go along with this webinar. And as I said, this webinar, once it goes through our clearance process, it should be posted on our OCS website in a few weeks. And for those for getting some information that the link is corrupt or you're not able to download it, for those people who are not able to get that over the chat, please reach out to me, or you can reach out to any one of us at the LIHEAP staff, and we'll get that information to you right away. Okay, so I don't see any more. I don't see any more questions. When I say LIHEAP staff, I'm referring to anyone. Let me just put my information in the chat real quick. Okay, so you have my information right there if you're not able to download any of the attachments that I put in the chat box. So please take that down and reach out to me, and I will definitely make sure you get that information right away. Okay, so we thank you very much for your time. If there's no more questions here, we're gonna give you back 3 minutes of your time of your day. Thank you for everyone who signed on for today, and we really appreciate. We hope you found this webinar very informative. So thank you very much.